December 20th, 1944, Luxembourg City. Snow pushed against the window panes of 1st Army Group headquarters. Inside, the air was hot and stale, thick with cigarette smoke and fear. General Omar Bradley stood with his back to the room, one hand gripping the edge of a map table, the other crushing a black Bakelite receiver so hard his knuckles had turned bone white. On the other end of the line, hundreds of miles away, Dwight D. Eisenhower sounded calm. Too calm. "Brad," Ike said, "I've made my decision. The 1st and 9th Armies are going under Field Marshal Montgomery." For a second, Bradley didn't answer. The map's in front of him, thin colored pencil lines showing American units struggling to contain Hitler's surprise offensive in the Ardennes, blurred at the edges. Finally, his composure cracked. "By God, Ike," Bradley exploded, "I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. I resign." There it was, raw, unfiltered, the private voice of a man who had just watched 2 of his American armies handed, in the middle of a crisis, to a British field marshal he neither liked nor trusted. What came back down the wire was ice. "Brad," Eisenhower replied, "I, not you, am responsible to the American people. Your resignation, therefore, means absolutely nothing." The room fell silent. Staff officers pretended to shuffle papers. Typewriters froze mid-keystroke. Everyone understood they were listening to more than an argument. They were listening to 3 years of tension, suspicion, and bruised pride finally explode. Bradley tried once more to protest. Then, realizing the conversation was over, he lowered the receiver with the slow, defeated motion of a man who'd been punched below the ribs. The decision stood. 2 American armies were now under the command of Bernard Law Montgomery. To the public back home, Monty was a hero in a jaunty beret, the victor of El Alamein, the man who had stopped Rommel, the commander who had helped plan D-Day. But inside American headquarters, from dusty tents in Tunisia to chateaux in France, there was another view of him, a darker one. The question that haunted American officers wasn't just, was Montgomery good? It was far more personal. Why did so many Americans come to dislike, distrust, and in some cases quietly hate him? Not the British, not the Canadians, not the idea of alliance. Him. To understand that answer, you can't just look at one battle, one press conference, or one operation. You have to rewind the tape all the way back to the North African desert, when American troops took their first hard punches of the war, and when Bernard Montgomery first stepped into their line of sight. North Africa, March 1943. The wind coming off the Tunisian hills smelled of burnt fuel and failure. Just weeks earlier, at Kasserine Pass, American troops had been hammered by veteran German forces. Tanks abandoned, guns captured, men scattered in confused retreat. It was the first real collision between green U.S. forces and the battle-hardened Wehrmacht, and the Americans had been hit like a car meeting a freight train. Into this mess stepped Lieutenant General George S. Patton. When Patton arrived to take over Thine Corps, he didn't see just wrecked vehicles and shaken soldiers. He saw something else that infuriated him even more, the attitude of his allies. British headquarters, especially the new boss, General Sir Harold Alexander of 18th Army Group, had already written their report. And it wasn't pretty. American troops, the report suggested, lacked discipline. American commanders lacked experience. American formations needed British supervision before they could be trusted with serious tasks. Not all of that was wrong. Kasserine had exposed genuine U.S. weaknesses in tactics, leadership, and coordination. But the British reaction went beyond tough love. In Alexander's view, American forces should now be pushed into the background, given supporting roles, minor attacks, or static positions, while British troops delivered the decisive blows. And standing behind Alexander, carrying the glow of recent fame, was Bernard Montgomery. Monty's stock was sky-high in early 1943. He had taken over the British Eighth Army in 1942, rebuilt morale after a string of humiliations, and beaten Rommel at El Alamein. His method was simple, at least on paper. Plan every detail, pile up overwhelming superiority in men and guns, and attack only when he was sure the odds were crushingly in his favor. To his own troops, this made him a hero. They believed, often rightly, that Monty wouldn't waste them casually. To many Americans, though, especially men like Patton, it came with a sneer. Montgomery's tone in conferences, his letters, his signals, it all carried the same underlying message. We, the British, know how to fight this war. You, the Americans, are enthusiastic, brave, and inexperienced. You'll learn under us. Alexander's plan for the final push in Tunisia made the hierarchy very clear. Eighth Army under Montgomery would smash through the Mareth line, the heavily fortified Axis position in southern Tunisia. Their attack would be the main effort. Patton's Nadu Corps? They were assigned supporting operations, attacks designed mostly to distract German forces and help Montgomery's offensive succeed. On paper, the logic was military, not personal. Monty commanded battle-tested troops. Patton's men were still learning. If you believed in experience above all, this made sense. But to Patton and many in his command, the pattern felt familiar and dangerous. The British lead. The Americans cover their flank. The British get the credit. Patton was determined to smash that pattern, even if it meant smashing some German tanks to make his point. On March 17, 1943, Patton launched his offensive near El Guetar. He drove his men hard. Uniform inspections, strict discipline, aggressive, orders. No more Kasserine, no more half-organized retreats. Officers who didn't lead from the front found themselves reassigned, or worse. 6 days later, at dawn on March 23rd, 50 tanks from Germany's 10th Panzer Division rolled out of the hills toward American lines. Their job was simple: crush two corps the way they'd crushed others. This time, the story was different. American artillery crews, properly sighted and coordinated, waited until the German tanks rolled into overlapping kill zones. When the order came, the valley exploded. Shell after shell slammed into the advancing panzers. U.S. tank destroyers, carefully placed along the flanks, picked off vehicles that tried to break through. By the end of the day, the valley floor was littered with burning German armor. The 10th Panzer Division had been stopped cold, not by British veterans, not by desert-hardened Commonwealth troops, but by Americans. For the first time in the war, American ground forces had gone head-to-head with experienced German armor and won. You might expect this to be the moment when British doubts began to fade. When Alexander's staff would stop talking about supervision and start talking about partnership. That's not what happened. Back at British headquarters, attention and most of the praise still flowed toward Montgomery's operations at the Mareth line. Signals, memos, and press briefings told a simple story. Eighth Army was smashing the enemy in the south. American forces were cooperating with this grand plan. The reality was more complicated. Montgomery's initial attack on the Mareth line stalled. German defenses, terrain, and weather forced him to adapt, shifting to a flanking maneuver that took time and cost momentum. Meanwhile, Patton's WW2 Corps was grinding forward in central Tunisia, drawing German forces away and slowly chewing them up. But in British reports, this American contribution appeared as background noise. The narrative remained. Monty leads, Americans assist. The final insult came with the victory parade in Tunis on May 20th, 1943. Eisenhower stood alongside Alexander and French General Henri Giraud as troops marched past. Flags, bands, medals. In speeches and coverage, British and French achievements were highlighted. American contributions were mentioned, but often as a supporting chorus, not as a main melody. For American officers who'd watched their men die in the hills and wadis of Tunisia, the lesson was brutal and unforgettable. Fighting alongside the British meant fighting for recognition as much as fighting the Germans. And whenever Bernard Montgomery was in the picture, there was never enough spotlight to go around. Summer 1943. New operation, new plan, same problem. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, was supposed to be a joint masterpiece. In reality, it became a test of egos and trust, and Montgomery was right at the center of the storm. The initial concept for Husky was fairly balanced. Multiple landings all around the island, with both American and British forces pushing inland, seizing ports, and splitting enemy defenses. Montgomery hated it. His experience in North Africa had convinced him that dispersed landings were a recipe for disaster. Better, he argued, to concentrate everything in one sector, his sector. Hit the southeastern corner of Sicily with massive force, drive straight up the east coast, seize Messina, and open the door to mainland Italy. The problem? That plan essentially turned the American Seventh Army into a bodyguard. Patton's job would be to protect Monty's flank, while Eighth Army made the decisive advance. Air and naval commanders, Tedder and Cunningham, warned against it. Concentrating the landings would leave Axis airfields untouched and ships vulnerable. They pushed back hard. Montgomery did what he often did when opposed. He raised the stakes. Backed by Churchill, he implied that if the plan wasn't changed, he would not take responsibility for the operation. In coalition warfare, that kind of implied resignation threat from your most famous field commander carries weight. Eisenhower, trying to keep the alliance together and the invasion on schedule, compromised. He gave Monty what he wanted. Landings would be concentrated in southeastern Sicily. Eighth Army would get the straight shot to Messina. Seventh Army would land to the west, cover the flank, and perform what the plan politely called supporting operations. When Patton read the final plan, he didn't need a staff study to understand what it meant. Once again, American troops were cast as auxiliary players in a British script. His diary captured his anger in language he'd never dare use in front of a microphone. Alexander, whose headquarters had almost no American officers, seemed perfectly comfortable placing an entire U.S. field army into a supporting role, while Montgomery went for the glory. On July 10, 1943, troops from both armies hit the beaches in pounding surf and chaotic conditions. Italian coastal defenses crumbled quickly. German units reacted more aggressively, slamming into U.S. forces at Gela with tanks and infantry. American troops held. Naval guns hammered German armor at almost point-blank range. After hard fighting, the beachheads were secure. Montgomery took this as confirmation of his theory. The Axis, he believed, were collapsing. The fastest way to end the campaign was to send Eighth Army straight up the East Coast. Patton's Americans once again should hold a defensive line and protect his left. Reality was not so accommodating. German commanders recognized Sicily's terrain advantage, the rugged interior and narrow coastal corridors, and moved quickly to exploit it. Near Catania, German paratroopers and infantry dug in and turned Montgomery's route into a meat grinder. Narrow approaches, minefields, and artillery turned each British attack into a costly slog. And then came the signal that changed everything. On July 12th, with his advance bogged down, Montgomery signaled Alexander and suggested extending Eighth Army's zone westward, right into an area previously allocated to the Americans. He wanted an additional main road, effectively pushing Seventh Army back, turning Patton's forces into a shield for his own maneuver. He didn't really ask, he informed. To American eyes, this was classic Monty. Assuming his own operations were central, everyone else's flexible, and American armies something to be rearranged on his map as needed. Alexander agreed. Patton was told to sit tight, defend, and accommodate the British extension. Officially, it was all about military necessity. Unofficially, it reinforced every suspicion American officers had about British intentions, and about Montgomery in particular. Patton swallowed his anger in public. In private, in his diary, he compared Montgomery to an overpraised prima donna and Alexander to a toady. But he also did something else. He created his own mission. If Seventh Army was not going to be given a decisive role, Patton would take one. He flew to Alexander's HQ, map in hand, and proposed a bold move. Instead of sitting on the defensive, Seventh Army would drive on Palermo, the largest city in Sicily, and cut the island in half. Alexander, perhaps happy to have Patton's aggression, pointed somewhere that didn't directly compete with Montgomery's axes, agreed. What followed turned the entire Sicily campaign into something Monty had never intended it to be. A race. Patton drove his army relentlessly toward Palermo. His officers, already used to his tempo, pushed their divisions hard. Engineers cut new roads out of rock and dirt. Infantry columns moved through mountainous terrain in sweltering heat. The advance was risky, fast, and sometimes reckless. Within 12 days of the landings, American forces marched into Palermo. It was a major victory, a huge port, a political and psychological objective, and proof that American forces could move with a speed and audacity few had expected in early 1943. Montgomery, still stuck against strong German defenses near Etna, reacted in a very different way. From his perspective, Patton's success didn't prove much. The Americans, he believed, had primarily faced Italian units, less determined and less capable than German troops. Eighth Army, by contrast, was dealing with the best the enemy had to offer in the toughest sector of the island. It was the same pattern American commanders had already seen. Their achievements explained away, their difficulties chalked up to inexperience. British operations framed as decisive no matter what the map actually showed. When Patton's columns eventually turned east from Palermo and began pushing along the northern coast toward Messina, the competition turned personal. Both armies were now converging on the same target from different directions. Both understood what reaching Messina first would mean, not militarily, since the Germans were already evacuating across the strait, but symbolically. Patton, driving his men forward in a series of leapfrogging amphibious hops and mountain marches, was determined to beat Montgomery. Montgomery, still grinding forward against the German rearguard, insisted that the comparison was unfair. Different terrain, different enemy, different circumstances. On August 17, 1943, elements of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina first. British units arrived hours later. American newspapers crowed. The supporting army had won the race to the prize. For many U.S. officers, it felt like long overdue payback for months of condescension. Montgomery's public reaction was courteous. He congratulated Patton, praised the Americans, and moved on. In private, and in the British press coverage that followed, another tone seeped through, the familiar reflex to minimize. American success was attributed to weaker opposition and softer roots. British progress was portrayed as the real hard fighting. Two smaller incidents during the Sicilian campaign drove the wedge even deeper. In one, word of Patton's infamous slapping of battle-fatigued soldiers reached British ears. For many in Montgomery's circle, it confirmed every stereotype about Americans: undisciplined, emotional, unstable. A British commander, they liked to say, would never behave that way. In another, Montgomery sent a liaison officer to Patton's HQ, a young lieutenant with a battered suitcase tied with string, no staff, and little equipment. Patton, who had sent Montgomery a full team of senior officers and communications gear, saw this as a deliberate insult. He sent the lieutenant back with a note. He didn't accept boys as liaison officers at an army headquarters. Was it petty? Maybe. But symbolically, it captured everything American commanders felt. They were fighting the same enemy, taking similar casualties, commanding armies of comparable size. Yet in Monty's world, they were still treated like junior partners. By the time the Sicily campaign ended, the Americans had learned three things about Bernard Montgomery that they would never forget. He was undeniably competent. He was obsessed with controlling the main effort, and he seemed incapable of treating American forces as co-equals. Those lessons would come back with a vengeance the following year, when the war moved from the Mediterranean to the heart of Western Europe. Fast forward to 1944. Montgomery's reputation was still powerful. He had taken over planning for the ground phase of Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, and he played a central role in shaping the D-Day landings and the initial breakout from the beaches. In the Normandy campaign, he commanded all Allied ground forces at first, British, Canadian, and American. For a time, American generals accepted his leadership as the price of unity. The beaches were secured. The anti-German line began to crack, but as the weeks passed, the balance inside the alliance shifted. More American divisions arrived. More American factories poured out tanks, trucks, and aircraft. By late summer, the majority of Allied ground forces in Northwest Europe were American. U.S. logistics, U.S. air power, and U.S. manpower formed the backbone of the campaign. On September 1, 1944, Eisenhower formally assumed direct command of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery was reduced to leading 21st Army Group, the British and Canadian armies on the northern wing. Omar Bradley commanded the 12th U.S. Army Group to the south and center. On paper, this was just a logical adjustment to reflect reality. In Montgomery's mind, it was a demotion. He believed, and often openly said, that Eisenhower lacked the battlefield experience to run a land campaign. In Monty's view, Ike should have stayed above the fight, coordinating politics and logistics, while somebody else directed ground operations, and by somebody else, Montgomery meant himself. This clashed directly with American instincts. U.S. commanders didn't see the war as an opportunity for one British field marshal to write his personal legend. They saw a massive coalition effort, supported overwhelmingly by American industry and manpower, led by an American supreme commander who balanced multiple fronts, allies, and political constraints. The stage was set for the most controversial chapter of Montgomery's career, the battle over strategy in late 1944. Broad front versus Monty's single thrust. By September 1944, German forces in France were in disarray. After the breakout from Normandy and the Falaise Pocket, units retreated in chaos. Paris fell. Allied columns raced toward the borders of Belgium and Germany. Many believed the war might be over by Christmas. The Americans, led by Eisenhower and Bradley, favored what became known as the broad front strategy. Advance on a wide line, keep constant pressure everywhere, prevent the Germans from concentrating reserves, and slowly punch through into the Reich. Montgomery argued for something very different. He wanted a single, massive thrust in the north, his sector. Concentrate supplies, fuel, and reinforcements under his command. Punch across the Rhine, grab the Ruhr industrial region, and maybe even race on toward Berlin before the Germans could reorganize. It wasn't just a strategic disagreement, it was a political one. To implement Monty's plan, Eisenhower would have had to do three things American officers found deeply offensive: take vital resources away from American armies that were already driving hard into Germany, hand the main effort, and therefore most of the glory, to a British commander whose national contribution was now much smaller than America's. Except that if the decisive blow succeeded, history would likely remember it as Montgomery's victory. To Patton, who was already pushing Third Army toward the German border, the idea of slowing down so that Montgomery could take the lead felt like madness. To Bradley, it felt like a denial of reality. This was now an American-led war, whatever the sentimental attachment to British prestige. Eisenhower tried, as always, to split the difference. He wouldn't shut down American offensives, but he would give Montgomery priority for a limited operation in the Netherlands, a bold move to capture key bridges and potentially open the way to the Rhine. That operation would go down in history as Market Garden. And when it failed, the Americans' issues with Monty would go from frustration to something close to fury. September 17, 1944. Dutch skies were filled with planes and parachutes as 3 airborne divisions, 2 American, 1 British, dropped into the Netherlands. Their objective was straightforward on paper and incredibly risky in reality: seize a chain of bridges from Eindhoven to Nijmegen to Arnhem, then hold them long enough for British ground forces to race up a single highway, Hell's Highway, and cross the Rhine. If everything worked, 21st Army Group would suddenly have a bridgehead over the river, the kind of position Montgomery had been demanding. But German resistance in Holland hadn't collapsed. Armored units, including SS Panzer divisions, were already in the area. Intelligence warnings existed. They weren't properly weighted. Airborne troops landed too far from their objectives. The ground advance was funneled onto one narrow road, easily blocked and hard to bypass. German counterattacks hit from both sides. At Arnhem, British paratroopers under John Frost fought heroically to hold the bridge. Isolated, low on supplies, they waited for an armored relief that never reached them. 9 days later, Market Garden was over. Thousands of Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Arnhem hadn't been secured. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The grand northern breakthrough Montgomery had promised did not exist. To Bradley and Patton, this was exactly what they'd warned about: a high-risk, high-cost gamble that had sucked in scarce airborne divisions, fuel, and attention, and failed. Disappointment is one thing. Commanders make mistakes. Operations fail. What truly enraged American officers was what Montgomery said afterwards. Instead of calling it what it was, a costly defeat, he told the world that Market Garden had been 90% successful. 2 bridges captured, some territory liberated. The failure at Arnhem, he implied, was only a small blemish on an otherwise brilliant concept. To men who had seen entire battalions wiped out and thousands of paratroopers taken prisoner. This sounded less like leadership and more like spin. It fit a pattern they thought they'd already seen. When things went well, Monty's planning and genius were front and center. When they went badly, the blame dissolved into fog, insufficient resources, unexpected circumstances. Others didn't support the plan. It didn't stop there. Montgomery began criticizing Eisenhower's broad front strategy more openly, suggesting that had his plan been fully adopted, the war would already be over. To American eyes, this was staggering. Eisenhower had given him extra fuel, extra priority, and one of the largest airborne operations in history. Market Garden had failed on execution, not on supplies, and yet Monty's public narrative turned it into a story of his almost victory blocked by other people's bad strategy. If Tunisia and Sicily had planted the seed of American dislike, Market Garden watered it with blood. But the worst collision was still to come. It would happen not in triumph, but in crisis, in the freezing forests of the Ardennes. December 16, 1944. Without warning, the German army launched its last great offensive in the West. In the snow-covered woods of the Ardennes, they smashed into thinly held American lines with tanks, infantry, and overwhelming artillery. Units were overrun. Towns were captured. Prisoners were massacred. On the map, a bulge appeared in the Allied front. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For several days, the situation was chaotic. American commanders like Bradley, Hodges, and Gero were trying to figure out where their units even were. Some formations had been broken. Roads were jammed. Weather grounded much of Allied air power. On December 20th, Eisenhower made a controversial but militarily logical decision. He temporarily shifted control of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, both north of the Bulge, under Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Someone had to coordinate the northern sector. Monty's headquarters was already in position. That's the decision that triggered Bradley's furious phone call. That's the moment we opened with. From a purely military perspective, Montgomery did his job well. He stabilized the northern shoulder, repositioned units, and prepared for coordinated counterattacks. He placed British reserves along the Meuse as a last-ditch defensive line in case the Germans broke through. When American forces, including Patton's Third Army, counterattacked from the south and the weather finally cleared, the German offensive ran out of fuel, literally and figuratively. The Bulge began to shrink. Militarily, this was coalition warfare at its best. American troops did the bulk of the fighting. British dispositions provided depth. Monty's coordination in the north, Patton's dash in the south, and Eisenhower's overall management combined to turn Hitler's last gamble into a disaster for Germany. But war isn't just fought on maps. It's also fought in newspapers, speeches, and memories. And this is where Montgomery took a victory that belonged mostly to American soldiers and turned it into a political wildfire. On January the 7th, 1945, with the crisis past, Montgomery held a press conference. He started well enough. I praised American soldiers. He acknowledged their courage. But slowly, the emphasis began to shift. He described how, when he took over, he had tidied up the battle, how he had calmly organized the defense, how he had balanced the line, foreseen possible German advances, and made sure the Meuse crossings were secure. He spoke of the battle as one of the most interesting and tricky he had ever handled. If you read the transcript cold, you might say, he's just proud of his work. But to American commanders, who had watched their own men die in frozen foxholes, it sounded like something very different. It sounded like a British field marshal stepping in for 3 weeks, then publicly talking as though he had saved the Americans from their own incompetence. The names that were missing spoke volumes. Bradley's role, barely mentioned. Hodges, almost invisible. Patton's pivot north to relieve Bastogne, a feat of operational agility that stunned even his critics. Downplayed to the point of being barely there. To the American officers listening, it felt like historical theft in real time. Bradley was livid. This wasn't just Montgomery being arrogant in private. This was a public press conference, broadcast to the world, in which the most desperate American land battle of the war was reframed as a triumph of British calm under Monty's genius. Bradley told Eisenhower he could not serve under Montgomery. If this was a prelude to Monty being given more authority over American armies, he would resign. Eisenhower, usually serene, was furious as well. Privately, he considered asking for Montgomery's relief, removing him from command, unless something changed. In London, Churchill understood the danger. The alliance was at risk over one man's mouth. Behind the scenes, British leaders leaned hard on Montgomery. The field marshal wrote contrite letters to Eisenhower and Bradley, expressing regret and praising American performance. On paper, the crisis ended. In reality, it never did. After the Bulge, American commanders no longer just disliked Monty. Many of them ceased to trust him. They saw a pattern. When things went bad, he deflected. When others bled, he downplayed. When the cameras turned on, he stepped into the center of the frame, even if it was American dead in the background. From that point to the end of the war, the relationship never really recovered. So, why did they hate him? By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the immediate tensions were buried under celebration. The alliance had won. Montgomery received his share of British honors. American commanders went home to parades. But as memoirs appeared in the late 1940s and 1950s, the old resentments resurfaced. Patton's diaries dripped with contempt for Monty. Bradley's memoirs carefully documented every slight, every strategic clash, every press conference. Eisenhower, now President of the United States, eventually cut off personal correspondence after Montgomery's book once again criticized his leadership. British historians defended Monty. They pointed out correctly that he never lost a major battle once he took command in North Africa. They argued that his insistence on preparation and overwhelming force saved lives. They credited him with much of the solidity of the D-Day plan. American historians pointed to Tunisia, Sicily, Market Garden, and the Bulge, and asked a different question. What is the value of a great battlefield commander who is poison in a coalition? At the heart of American resentment were three things. First, status. By 1944-45, American troops, factories, ships, and aircraft were carrying the lion's share of the war in the West. Yet Montgomery continued to speak and act as though British leadership was, by default, superior, and that American strength should be harnessed to British wisdom. For U.S. commanders whose men were filling the cemeteries, this felt like being treated as colonials in their own war. Second, credit and blame. When Monty won El Alamein, his handling of early Normandy, his role was loudly proclaimed. When operations were indecisive or failed, Sicily's politics, Market Garden, his part in the Bulge narrative, the responsibility became fuzzy, spread around, or reframed as almost success. American generals didn't demand false modesty, but they expected something basic. If your plan fails, you own it. Most of them, especially Patton and Bradley, were blunt about their own mistakes. They never saw that same bluntness from Monty. Third, respect. Underneath the strategies and operations was something even more basic, how he made them feel in the room. From North Africa onward, Montgomery spoke to American commanders like senior to junior, tutor to student. He talked at them, not with them. On maps and in signals, their armies often came across as tools to be allocated to his design, not equal partners in a shared effort. In 1796, Americans had fought a revolution against the idea that they were permanent juniors in the British world system. In the 1940s, many of their generals felt those old ghosts stirring again, this time in staff conferences instead of royal decrees. Montgomery wasn't the only British commander who struggled to accept that the balance of power had shifted, but he became the lightning rod, the symbol. To a British public desperate for heroes in a twilight empire, Bernard Law Montgomery was proof that Britain still produced great captains of war. To many American officers who fought alongside him, he was something else entirely. A brilliant tactician who could never quite accept that he wasn't the center of the story anymore. A careful commander whose caution sometimes let enemies escape, and whose ego sometimes wasted trust. A man who wanted American power in his order of battle, but not American equality at his table. In the end, the Americans didn't hate Montgomery because he was British, or because he was cautious, or even because he was arrogant. They hated him quietly, professionally, sometimes bitterly, because in a war their country was increasingly winning. He still made them feel like colonial auxiliaries, good enough to bleed, not good enough to be believed. And in coalition warfare, where victory depends as much on human respect as on guns and tanks, that kind of contempt is one enemy no alliance can afford for long. Before we move on, if you love deep dive, no-nonsense WW2 history, hit subscribe. It tells YouTube this story is worth pushing to more people, and helps us keep bringing you the truth the textbooks leave out. The winter of 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. Germany was collapsing on all fronts. American factories were turning out tanks and trucks faster than German industry could repair what it already had. British troops, though exhausted after 5 years of war, were holding their lines with professionalism carved from bitter experience. The Soviet Union was smashing through the Eastern Front with armies that stretched beyond the horizon. And yet, in the Allied High Command, the atmosphere was turning colder than the Ardennes snow. Montgomery still commanded Britain's Northern Army Group, the 21st. Bradley commanded the 12th for the Americans. Patton, the 3rd. Hodges, the 1st. Simpson, the 9th. All were powerful personalities, but none created more quiet dread in a briefing room than Montgomery. By late 1944, the Americans had begun to see a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Pattern 1. When Montgomery entered a room, respect stopped being mutual. He rarely arrived early, often arrived late, and always acted as if he were the only man present who truly understood war. At one conference outside Brussels, Bradley arrived with his senior staff already seated. Monty entered the room without looking at them, placed his beret on the table, and launched straight into a lecture on the correct way to command large armies. For Bradley, a quiet, methodical officer who valued teamwork, that was like being slapped in the face. Patton, in a different meeting, whispered to Eisenhower, "He talks to us like we're children studying arithmetic." Eisenhower, tired and overworked, simply sighed. He had learned long ago that Monty wasn't going to change. The only question was how to prevent his personality from blowing the alliance apart. Pattern 2. Monty didn't handle success shared with others. The spotlight had to be his. This, Americans believed, explained Sicily. It explained Market Garden. It explained the press conference after the Bulge. And soon it would explain something even deeper: why American officers thought Montgomery never truly respected them. We saved them. The sentence that broke the dam. In the bitter days after the Battle of the Bulge, Monty's press conference spread across the Atlantic like wildfire. Headlines in Britain were flattering. Headlines in America were furious. One phrase repeated in almost every American command post came not from the newspapers, but from a British officer present during Montgomery's talk with reporters. The officer later admitted that Monty, in private, had said something along these lines: "The Americans were in confusion. I had to save the situation." Patton nearly threw his coffee across the room when he heard it. Save the situation? American soldiers had held Bastogne. American divisions had absorbed the full shock of Hitler's last offensive. American dead lay in the forests by the thousands, and Montgomery claimed he had saved them. Even Eisenhower, the most diplomatic officer in the entire Allied order of battle, could barely control his temper. He wrote in a private memo, "Montgomery is splendid in many ways, but completely unable to grasp the political necessities of coalition warfare." Translated from Eisenhower speak, that meant, he's brilliant, but he's also a danger. Behind all the tactical arguments, broad front versus narrow thrust, Sicily routes, Tunisia priorities, there was a deeper, unspoken source of tension. Montgomery treated the Americans as if Britain were still the global superpower and the U.S. were simply helping. This was 1944, not 1844. The Americans weren't junior partners anymore. They were supplying most of the armies, most of the trucks, most of the planes, most of the food, most of the fuel, most of the ammunition, and taking immense casualties doing it. And yet Montgomery acted like British brains were guiding American muscle. It echoed something older, something that still stung in the American identity, something going back to the Revolution itself. They had broken away from British authority in 1776, and here was a British field marshal treating them like colonial troops again. This wasn't just pride, it was history. And Montgomery, without ever meaning to, triggered it again and again. By February 1945, the Allied advance into Germany had become almost entirely American-driven. Bradley and Patton were breaking through the Siegfried Line. Simpson's Ninth Army was preparing massive operations along the Rhine. Hodges' First Army had clawed back every inch lost during the Bulge. Montgomery was still a major player. He commanded the entire northern wing. But the scale of the American effort simply dwarfed everything else. And yet, as victory neared, Monty made one final push for the kind of authority he felt he deserved. He argued once more that Eisenhower should step back from directing ground forces and give operational command to a single commander. Naturally, Montgomery believed that commander should be himself. It didn't happen. The Americans would not allow the man who belittled them in conferences and rewrote failures as triumphs to command the bulk of their armies. Eisenhower kept overall control. Bradley kept his. Patton drove deep into Germany. Simpson pushed toward the Ruhr. And Montgomery's role became what many Americans felt it should have been all along: important, respected, but not central. For many American commanders, the greatest wound came not during the war, but after. In 1958, Montgomery published his memoirs. They were devastating in one direction, toward Eisenhower. Monty claimed that if Eisenhower had listened to him, the war would have ended earlier. Fewer lives would have been lost, and Germany might have been defeated before the Ardennes ever happened. To the Americans, this was the final betrayal. Eisenhower, the man who held the alliance, together with diplomacy, patience, and iron self-control, was now being attacked by the very subordinate whose personality had nearly torn that alliance apart. Ike was President of the United States when he read the memoirs. He closed the book, put it down, and never again accepted personal correspondence from Montgomery. The break was total. So, why did the Americans hate Bernard Montgomery? Here is the truth in one breath. Because he was brilliant, but he made them feel like they were apprentices, even as they were carrying the war on their shoulders. Because he demanded credit, and rarely shared it. Because he publicly criticized American strategy, but never publicly accepted responsibility for his own failures. Because he spoke the language of confidence, but delivered it in the tone of condescension. Because he treated America as if it were a junior ally in a war America was overwhelmingly paying for. Because he could win battles, but couldn't win trust. And because in a war fought by millions, he made the partnership feel like a hierarchy. A brilliant field marshal, yes. A national hero? Absolutely. But to many American commanders, from Tunisia to Sicily, to Normandy to the Bulge, Bernard Law Montgomery was a reminder of something older, heavier, and far more personal. The war was supposed to be fought against Germany, not against the ego of an ally, and that is why the Americans, though they respected his skill, admired his discipline, and acknowledged his victories, also carried a quiet, burning dislike of the man in the black beret. A feeling that no victory parade and no post-war handshake ever truly erased.